For our learning about past pandemics presentation, we researched the bubonic plague or the Black Death and what kind of impacts it had on society in the 14th century and beyond. So the first documented outbreak of the plague was in Sicily in 1347. And following that, the most deadly wave lasted from 1347 to 1351. After that, there were recurring outbreaks for centuries up until around the start of the 20th century. However, it's still around today in very rare instances. The bubonic plague or the Black Death is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, which is transmitted through animals, specifically rats and the fleas that they carry. The name, the Black Death, comes from the purple and black coloration of the skin, along with boils that are caused by the infection. And compared to COVID-19, I think it's important to note that the Black Death is a bacterial infection as opposed to a virus, which is transmitted mostly from person to person. Estimated mortality rates range between around 1/8 to 2/3 of the European population at the time. And this translated to roughly 25 million Europeans dying because of the pandemic, and some estimates are even as high as 50 million. Compared to the Spanish flu, which could have killed more people in total in the early 20th century, the plague was much worse in terms of mortality rates as a percentage of the total population at that time.
So at the onset of the epidemic, there wasn't an understanding of how the disease was transmitted, nor the pathology of the bacterium that induced it. As a result of this, most authorities didn't have a comprehensive plan of how to mitigate the risk of transmission. One notable exception, however, was the Republic of Venice, which sat in the northeastern territories of what is modern-day Italy. At the time when the outbreak first began, the Venetians controlled a series of islands in the Ionian Sea, which sat between them and the Greek peninsula. Archival data has revealed that in response to the bubonic plague, ships attempting to dock at these ports were intently interrogated and had to remain in a state of isolation for 30 to 40 days. So roughly analogous to quarantine prescriptions that we experience today. Moreover, garrisons issued by Venice helped in controlling the movement of people on the islands, similar to modern day capacity mandates and curfews enforced by local law enforcement. In later centuries, after the plague had faded and reemerged in Europe, health boards were erected on the islands, along with a system of daily aggregate reports. Lazarettos, or quarantine institutions, were also constructed in greater frequency, and whenever outbreaks were suspected or realized, contact with the mainland territories would cease, and all response measures would shift to the local officials and health officers. Directly across the sea in the Ottoman-controlled Greek peninsula, many of these regulatory policies were absent, and as a result, the region experienced more recurrences of the plague over the same period.
As Edward mentioned, the bubonic plague took out a huge percentage of the European population. And we can see this in England in 1351. The bubonic plague really hurt the working class, and it killed off a lot of the labor supply. And those workers that were left found themselves able to demand a higher wage from their employers or their lords under the feudal system. And if their lord was not willing to accommodate that, they would easily be able to find someone who would, just because the demand for labor was so much higher than the supply. So in response, Edward III of England put out the Statute of Laborers, which mandated that everyone that is able-bodied, unemployed, and under the age of 60 must work. And it also capped wages at pre-pandemic levels, so it made it illegal to either receive or pay a wage higher than what you received before the pandemic. Although it wasn't very well enforced, wages continued to rise. And then later on in England, about the late 16th century or so, they finally adopted the quarantine policy. It took them a few hundred years to get there, as it was first adopted in Italy in the late 1300s. But basically the components of English plague policy or quarantine policy were the shutting up of houses and parish pest houses for those infected with the plague, shutting up of houses is exactly what it sounds like. They would literally show up, board up the house, including with the inhabitants inside it, whether they were infected or not, if they were exposed. Sometimes people were just shut in there with them. It would last for at least 40 days, in many cases more, and especially if someone died there. In some cases, the building would be out of use for a whole year. And then parish pest houses were for those that were infected. Sometimes instead of being shut up, they would put them all in these pest houses where basically infected people would go and stay for the duration of their quarantine. And economically, this quarantine policy was really hardest on the middle class, called the partially chargeable people, because they didn't receive any help from the government, but they also couldn't afford to pay for all their living expenses without work, whereas the poor would get government aid and the rich would be able to afford it. And oftentimes quarantine was used as a punishment for people that violated other orders, and so it got a really bad reputation among the general public, specifically for that use.
So while it is suspected that the plague had its origins in the East, it eventually had outbreaks and made its way into different parts of Asia. Some of this was likely attributed to trading with Western territories, as well as colonial activity in the region. Um, Outbreaks in Bombay and in colonial India prompted a local doctor by the name of Acacio Villegas to launch a sanitation effort in the city. Eventually, colonial authorities brought in a Russian doctor by the name of Valdemar Haifkin. Haifkin had created a cholera vaccine at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and he's credited with creating the first vaccine response to the bubonic plague. While this vaccine did have some undesirable side effects, it did reduce the risk of contraction by about 50%, according to estimations. And his legacy is remembered in the region through the Haifkin Institute for Infectious Disease in Mumbai, which is the modern day iteration of Bombay. Other measures, such as the Special Plague Committee and the Bombay City Improvement Trust, were some early predecessors to modern day infectious disease organizations like the CDC and government run sanitation departments.
So as far as short-term impacts, like I said earlier, most estimates of the total deaths in Europe are around 50% of the population. So with the population decrease this large, there were huge reductions in commercial activity, and obviously the workforce was decreased significantly. Also, a lot of the skills and knowledge that were typically passed down through apprenticeships or family business were lost. And this is something that was really important at the time because most of the spread of information was through word of mouth. And in the 14th century, that supported a lot of the economic activity. Some reorganization also occurred when a lot of peasants moved into vacant areas of land. And in some cases, this has allowed for resources to be used more efficiently after the pandemic, and also decreased economic inequality directly following the plague. So we will see that some of the immediate negative impacts of the plague can in some cases lead to positive outcomes in the years that follow. And we'll get into that in the next slides.
In terms of long-term effects, the most consequential demographic change was actually that more young people died than old people. This and the continuous rebounds of the bacteria exacerbated the already massive labor shock. England actually had 30 plague years after the first wave, and due to the severe depopulation, an estimated 1,000 villages were destroyed there. So those small local economies, whatever existed, were decimated for a very long time. Cities, on the other hand, bounced back a little bit more quickly because of trade and growing urbanization trends. However, as Edward mentioned, because of the loss of skilled labor, we saw, unfortunately, the resurgence of the slave trade, specifically in Mediterranean cities. Another consequence in the cities were that the wealth of rich urban families increased because their assets could now be concentrated into less hands. So as a result, the rich got richer. In terms of some more positive long-term effects that came from the bubonic plague, These labor shocks actually led to some advancements for workers. With less rural laborers, those who were left were paid more. And since landowners just needed to get people to farm and to live on their land, workers are actually able to demand higher wages and rents, and they ended up getting them. This is a pretty interesting example of workers demanding rights that we definitely did not see in the feudal times before the Black Death. The wages continued to increase for the next 150 years or so until the population rebounded. I think the most interesting long-term effect is with economic efficiency. After the initial shock of the Black Death subsided, we saw economic efficiency increase in England. With limited rural workers, there was actually a forced shift in the structure of agricultural systems. There was an expansion of the capital market and more rural manufacturing and rural tool production was created, and it actually increased output per person. This capital intensive strategy continued to grow. And this transitionary period has now been dubbed proto industrialization. And some scholars argue that in the long term, this structural change helped to set the stage for the Industrial Revolution in England just a few hundred years later.
So one thing that we saw with the Black Death, it had a really big influence on different cultures across the European and Asian continent. So for the Christian religion, it was generally believed to come from supernatural forces and or the wrath of God. And the records from the plague actually come mostly from Christian and Muslims, as papers written by Jewish scholars are mostly burned as they were blamed for the plague by different Christian communities. In Europe, the church's failure to stem the plague led to a decline in the medieval church's power, which also later contributed to the Protestant Reformation from 1517 to 1648 CE. However, as we're going to see in the next slide a little bit, the Islamic religion stayed mostly intact as dying from the plague was viewed as a form of martyrdom and sacrifice rather than an individual like failing God. So in the Christian community, the plague was viewed as a punishment from God. The infection was due to individual life choices such as sinning. In the Muslim community, the plague was viewed as a merciful gift from God. Christians could leave plague-stricken areas for clean areas. Muslims could not. Christians thought the plague was contagious and could be passed between people. Muslims thought the plague was not contagious, but it came directly from God and went to specific individuals according to God's will. One thing really interesting about the Christian movement or the Christian community was the flagellant movement, which is people basically committing self-harm in the middle of communities to kind of like have penance for their sins and also the community sins. The Christian community, unlike the Muslim community, which had respect for Jewish physicians, the Christian community actively persecuted Jews. The bubonic plague created toxic culture, allowing Christians to act on long-held anti-Semitism. And a big part of this tension was that Jews were the moneylenders of the communities because it was viewed as a sin in the Christian community to have any type of or work with like money lending. So Jews were typically the lenders, and they really had to like press the Christian communities to pay back, which is really hard to do during the plague times because there was no like economic prosperity and everybody was kind of like hurting from the pandemic. Some of the lessons learned that we can take away and apply to these COVID times is religious implications. We see people really grounding themselves in their religion, and kind of like finding like renowned like faith and community, which we've seen with like people attending like online church mass. Also, stress from pandemic can result in radical human action. We saw that with like the storming of the Capitol and different just like crazy radical human events over the summer, and then fleeing from more urbanized communities. So actually, in this picture, we can see during the bubonic plague, a wealthy Italian family is in their like mountain home retreat, and then more like peasants are outside, and we saw like families in New York flee to their like mountain areas, and like people in San Francisco, I know personally I'm from the mountains in Utah, and we saw so many additional families come and stay there.
Yeah, and also during this time, we can look at the case study with the Republic of Venice and even look at the coronavirus today, that government inaction or proactive responses can make a huge difference. And unfortunately, as with that case study, inaction on the case of the Ottoman-controlled Greek peninsula can lead to a lot more deaths and casualties from the pandemic. And we can even look at some differences between the responses with OECD countries today.
And then 6, we encourage you guys to think of your own lessons and parallels between the bubonic plague and COVID-19 today in your comments. Thank you very much for watching our presentation.